Welcome to another edition of AMC's podcast series. This is version 2 or part 2 of the interview with Bob Forbes and Graham Moore, two of the guys who have spent most of their lives racing cars and enjoying their life enormously. Gentlemen, good morning. How are you both?
Well, thanks, Raymond.
Good morning, everybody.
Now, I think what we're going to do today, because this is part 2 of a long conversation we've previously had, there's a little bit of carryover from the previous exercise, but I think what we're going to do today is we're going to draw a line under the 1980s because we've covered pretty much all of that. We're moving into the 1990s, and I'm going to start with Bob. I'm going to say, Bob, around about this time you became a team owner. You'd become a semi-retired racing driver. That team started with GIO-sponsored Commodores, and you had Mark Gibbs as your lead driver. Now, that was basically your first foray into major team ownership without being the lead driver yourself.
Yeah, that's right, Ray, yes.
Did you enjoy that as a process?
Oh, yes, it was fantastic. We had the backing of GIO, who were trying to find a market, for a younger market, because they were the government insurance office at the time, and they were known as Big, Safe and Friendly, and that was their logo, I should say. So they were trying to find a younger market, and they used motor racing
as the vehicle, if you'll pardon the pun.
Which was really driven by John Crawford and Peter Hyland from GIO.
Right, so because that sort of was probably the first time that a major insurance company had ventured into something as almost alien to insurance companies as motor racing is. Because at that time, pretty much every insurance company in the country was not – they didn't encourage people to go motor racing and insure with them.
That's true, Ray.
So this started with two Commodores or one? I can't remember.
One initially with Mark Gibbs.
Now, I'm going to get a little personal here because I can remember one day when you hired the short circuit at Warwick Farm in Sydney to have a press day. And first of all, I'd like to know, how did you manage to get that done? Because at that stage of the game, Warwick Farm had closed down many years before as a motor racing circuit, but the short circuit still existed. And that was unusual in the sense that Oran Park still existed, Amaroo Park still existed. You chose Warwick Farm. Was that just because of history?
I think it was because of history, yes. And I think it's a better place to have a launch of something like that.
It was a wonderful day because I can remember when we turned up for that day, you had everybody in the paddock, what used to be the paddock area. And the thing that stuck in my mind and still is there is when I was driving through, we used to go through almost the gardens and then through the gate and across the grass and then across the circuit to get into the paddock. Now, on that morning, I got halfway across the racetrack in my car and I stopped. And I literally got out of the car and looked, and I thought, I don't believe this racetrack was never that narrow, shortly. And it was, wasn't it? I mean, when you think about it, cars were going around that corner 2 and sometimes 3 wide, and yet it was as narrow as all get out.
Yes, it was. Quite a narrow circuit, particularly in that area. Yes. But it worked, didn't it?
Oh, it worked wonderfully. It worked wonderfully.
So, and the Formula One cars, what were effectively Formula One cars, were racing there. So
they had to pass each other around the corner.
That's right.
Yeah. So, I mean, when you think about racetracks of today, I mean, when you look at that, it's not even half the width of a current racetrack.
No, that's right.
But then again, of course, the cars were much smaller in those days.
Yes, yeah. But how did we organise it? Well, I think GIO might have had something to do with that. I think Peter Hyland may have talked to someone.
He had a contact.
At the AJC or something, I think.
Because at that stage of the game, early 90s, that hadn't been used for a long time.
No.
And still hasn't been used for a long time.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a great shame, though.
Yeah, no, I honestly don't remember back that far as to how we got it organised, but it did happen and it was fantastic. Yeah. We used to go there quite a bit and practice when it was, when the AARC the Australian Automobile Racing Club when they owned it, they managed it on behalf of the AJC Jockey Club, the Australian Jockey Club.
That's one of those unfortunate things. Many racetracks are gone. Warwick Farm is still there, but the circuit is long gone and probably will never come back, unfortunately. Okay, switching to the other side of the table. Graham, good morning, Graham.
Good morning.
Let's start where we sort of finished off last time. I want to go back to, I guess, mid-'80s, even though we said we're going to draw a line under the 80s. The one I want to talk about is the rather unfortunate weekend you spent with the Mitsubishi Starion at Bathurst in 1985. Now, that was the first year that we ran Group A in touring cars. So the improved production cars finished up in 84. 85 was the first of those international races. And you ended up in the Mitsubishi team. Now, how did that take place?
Basically, Bob Riley built the car, and he was affiliated, obviously, with Rally Art. He had all the technical know-how and whatever. And, 6 months before Bathurst, he rang up and said, would you like to be part of the deal? And I go, yeah, that would be fantastic, So I went up to this workshop many times just to have a look, see what was going on. And he said, do you want to bring Michelle out to drive with you? I go, yeah, that'd be great, So the car was an absolutely beautifully built motor car. And Bob is a ultimate engineer. Like, he's still going today. He's a very, very clever guy. And when we got to Bathurst, we didn't do any testing in the car. We got to Bathurst, and it had a really bad miss in the corner, middle of the corner. It just virtually was cutting the engine out. And so he battled and battled and battled and had every expert trying to find the electrical problem. And in the end, we didn't start the car because it was actually pretty dangerous. We did the practice sessions, and it was a dangerous thing. Halfway through a corner, engine cut out, off he went again. So he decided to pull the car from the race and took it back to the workshop, and they stripped the wiring loom out of the car, and they found just a single wire where they'd been pulling it through this hole in the firewall was short-circuiting. It had been stripped, and it was just touching as the car would move and the engine would move a little bit. That was shorting out the computer. So, look, Bob did everything he possibly could to make it a good day, but he made the decision, and we went along with it. It was pretty dangerous to drive, yeah.
Yeah, the interesting thing about that story, I guess, Bill Tuckey, who was writing the official history books on the great race in those years, he had written in the book, he said, some said the car was withdrawn from the race at the request of the RSPCA to prevent any further cruelty to a poor dumb animal. So I guess the car just had one of those awful weekends.
Yeah, I liked Bill's writing, and he was always a bit of a character. I didn't enjoy that too much.
I bet you didn't. Anyway, staying with you, Graham, as late as the late 1980s, everything changed for the 90s because you had a string of, let's call them, unsuccessful Bathurst races. We won't go into too many details unless you want to tell us, do you have any memories of that particular gap in your career?
Well, 86, 87 was good. We got into 91. We'd purchased a car off Larry, and we'd leased it first and then purchased it. Look, you can only do what you do with what you've got. And we went up there with a really good car from Perkins and didn't finish the race. We had an engine problem in practice, and it's quite a funny story about that, actually. And
I'm all into funny stories, please.
You want the funny story? Well, I went out in the car in practice, and it just didn't feel right, the engine. And I came back in after about 3 laps, and Larry had given us his engine guy to look after, the engine part of the deal. And I said, mate, this doesn't feel right. I'm not happy with the engine. And are you sure? I said, mate, it feels awful. So we go down to see Larry, and I said, Larry, I'm not happy with an engine, mate. I think there's a problem with it. And he goes, listen, Cock, you drive the car and I'll build the engines. Now get off. So off we go.
Dismissed. Yes.
Dismissed. So I jump in the car again and I drive up the hill, and I get coming out of the cutting and it's getting worse. So I pull over and backed it into that little slot there where it's safe and sound. And anyway, they tow it home, and I get back, and Larry comes up and just looks at it and walks away. He said, pull the engine out. So we pull the engine out. We took the sump off it, and Larry had forgotten to do up one big end bolt, well, one big end nut. And so we called him down, and we go, Larry, this is what happens. Oh, good, Cock. He said, you saved me $100,000. Oh, okay. That's cool. And he put the had a practice engine, so we put that in for the race. Yeah, look, they're all experiences. You can't do much about them. And everything I've done in motorsport I've enjoyed, so.
Yeah, well, the thing is that, you have mechanical issues. I mean, that's part of the game, isn't it, really? You can prepare the car to almost to within an inch of its life. And then something, as Dick Johnson used to say, what 10-cent part are we going to break this year that we've never broken before? So that's the way it goes.
Yeah.
Back to you, Bob. We're starting at the early 1990s. As I said before, you got GIO sponsorship. You started with one car. You ended up with two. You had Kevin Bartlett and Russell Ingall as two of the drivers, along with Mark Gibbs. How did that all sort of come about? Because that's a sort of a crossover, isn't it? You had a very experienced driver in Kevin, and you had a young guy who'd just come out of Formula Ford in Russell Ingall, and you put those two guys together.
Yes, obviously intentionally. Put an old head with a young gun, and it worked very, very well. They got on well. Russell was absolutely fantastic. As you say, first time in a touring car. Yeah, he was telling us things we didn't really know. He said, you've got to fix the suspension on this thing. He said, it shouldn't be lifting wheels like it is. Yes, Russell.
And Formula Fords didn't lift wheels all that often either.
No. So I think it was a bit strange to him, probably, going to Bathurst and then being in a touring car. But no, they both did a fantastic job.
So that was the year 1990. But towards the end of 1990, there was you could almost call it a tsunami hit motor racing in this country with the arrival of Nissan and the GT-R. Now, Nissan had been around for a long time with turbo cars, the Bluebirds and other versions of turbos. But the Godzilla, I can remember when they took the cover off one of the cars at Bathurst in 1990, and that car was a maroon road car, and that was the first time anybody had seen one in this country. Now, you obviously decided that was the way to go pretty quickly for the 1991 season onwards.
That's right. It was just a weapon of a car. The concept was fine, and the rules, the shortcoming it had, or the short number of shortcomings that the car had as a road car, the Group A regulations allow you to address those issues, like the brakes, for instance. As a road car, the brakes were not good at all. They were all okay for one stop, but in a racing situation, they didn't work. So we just decided to go that way.
So did you buy the car from Fred, or did you buy the car from Nissan as a sort of a road car and then built it up as a race car?
Yeah, good question. No, Fred Gibson or his team did the whole lot.
Oh, okay. So basically,
I bought it from him as a finished car.
Right. So he'd built 2 cars for himself, and he built the 3rd car for you, pretty much as a little production line.
That's right.
Okay.
Yes. And I think our car was possibly the first one to hit the track. They brought the car up to Sydney, and we hired Amaroo Park for the day, and went out there and tested the car with Mark driving it.
Interestingly enough, I can remember when the car was first released, Wally Story, who was at that stage of the game the chief engineer at Holden Racing Team, he sort of said in a public arena, which I thought was really quite funny, he said, I don't think it's a twin-turbo car, it's 4-wheel drive, it's got 4-wheel steer. First of all, I don't think Freddie is going to run the 4-wheel steer. He just doesn't. He's not going to use that. And there's nothing we can do about the twin turbo, and we can't do anything about the 4-wheel. Well, we should be able to do something about the 4-wheel drive. He said, I think it should be a 2-wheel drive car like all the others. He said, I recommend that it should be front right and rear left.
Yeah, well, as you know, Wally is very, very smart. Bob Riley and he are similar. Yeah, so he's always got tongue-in-cheek, Wally, and of course it didn't happen, but it was a good try.
Exactly. So staying with you for just a minute, move on to 1992, which really was the first year that the car ran for the whole year, right? Now, you had your car on the front row of the grid. Now, you finished 3rd outright in the year that the race was stopped when Jim clipped the wall going through the cutting, broke the steering, and then went off the road at Forest Elbow, and the race was stopped. And we all know the story about what took place on the dais that day for the when the prizes were handed out. I suppose that was justification for you because you'd bought the only other car in that group, and you had a very, very successful run with it.
Yes, we did. Yes, and we finished 3rd, but we would have been 2nd only. We had a throttle sensor faulty, and
that was all it was.
It's all it was. The car kept running, but we couldn't run it at full revs.
Okay.
Yeah, so we dropped from 2nd to 3rd. But yeah, it did make it worthwhile. That's for sure.
Well, they were absolutely fantastic cars in their day.
Oh.
I think it's fair to say that those 3 cars were probably the fastest GT-Rs anywhere in the world.
I think they were. I think the Japanese were surprised. Fred did have a very good setup and did a very good job building those cars, no doubt about it.
Oh, they were beautifully prepared.
Yeah. And Eric, the engine guy, I think he ended up going to Japan, from what I recall, because they wanted to pick his brains.
Yeah, because, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on which way you look at it, really at the end of that season, 92, the war clouds were gathering on the horizon because Mike Raymond at Channel 7 didn't want the turbo cars anymore because at that stage of the game we had all sorts of cars running in the same category. We had the Nissans, we had the Sierras, we had BMWs running.
Yep.
There was quite a wide mixture of cars, including even Johnny Smith's Turbo Supra, what he called the Great White Whale. Unfortunately, all of those political pressures led to effectively the banning of the GT-Rs and the Sierras for the following year, basically from then on. So what do you think? Was that a fair thing, or was it just the fact that those cars were so much better than any of the other cars that they just out-engineered themselves?
I think that the latter. They did a fantastic job within the rules, and then it didn't work. The trouble with all that is that obviously you lose manufacturers because they're not going to go and build a 4-wheel drive, twin turbo car if it doesn't suit their market. So
that makes sense.
But to have that car racing in Group A, that changed everything, didn't it? Yeah, and that's where parity came in the end. Mm.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, as a sidebar on that, there was one, I actually spoke to Freddie Gibson about this many years later, and I said to him, there was only one day that your cars actually were driven to their full extent. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, Malala, 1992. Again, he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, I was there on that day, and on the first race of the 2 races that day, Mark and Jim were on the front row of the grid. off they go. About 10 laps into the race, Jim's car blows a turbo. They were just holding off the Sierras nicely. Jim's car pulls into the pits, big cloud of smoke, so he's out of that race. So they change the turbo, and he starts from the back row of the grid in the second race that afternoon. Now, there were about 30 cars in the race. Jim passed everybody back into the lead in 12 laps. So he passed all the Commodores and all the Sierras and the other GT-Rs into the lead in 12 laps.
Yeah.
And I sort of figured that was the only time we saw those cars really driven hard.
Yes.
Any comment about that?
Oh, no, I think you're right. Yeah, they didn't have to be driven 10/10ths all the time, that's for sure. Yeah.
Okay, well, now it's time to switch back to Graham for a minute. Graham, mid-90s, and you took yet another one of your sort of right-angle turns in your career of what you drive, and you joined the Toka group driving a Super Tourer. Mm-hmm. You went to England, you bought a Vauxhall Vectra, you brought that out to Australia, and not only did you do well, I mean, you came fifth in the championship that year against the two Works BMWs and the two Works Audis. Now, that was a pretty good result.
Yeah, it wasn't bad for an old bloke. I think I was about 52 at that stage. And they were sensational cars. That's what we should have. Look at the British touring cars. They're still going, still popular, still getting crowds. They're just good little high-tech gadget. Great to drive, do everything sort of nearly right, but very forgiving, yeah.
I mean, they must have been interesting. Front-wheel drive cars must be a very, very different animal. I mean, one of the first sort of really high-powered front-wheel drive cars we ever saw was when Freddie Gibson put his wife, Christine Gibson, in that Nissan Extra. Was turbocharged front-wheel drive car. Mm-hmm. And I remember Bobby Muir was with her that year, and they both said that the car was like a lead-tipped arrow. It would go anywhere in a straight line. But the Super Tourers were a whole different package, weren't they? They were much more pliable, much more drivable.
Yeah, I mean, they had a good differential in them. They'd done a lot of testing. The car we bought was one of Malik's cars, and they were British touring car champions. And you could adjust one thing on the car and feel it. They're really good. They had a sequential box in them way ahead of their time. They were just a very, very competitive car, and there were lots of other cars that competed very closely with them. You know, even the four-wheel drive Audis, they were sort of doing a bit of a Godzilla thing. They were sort of just easing back a little bit so they didn't get too far ahead, but the BMWs were great. They had Peugeots and even had a Hyundai in there and whatever. So it was a sort of series that should have kept going. But the V8 guys kept on and pushed them out in a sort of way. Yes. They're still out now. Yeah.
Yeah, that opens up an entirely different can of worms, doesn't it, that situation at that time?
Yeah.
Bob, come back to you. Again, we're talking about the early 1990s. Once the changeover took place and we got a classification which was effectively V8 Holdens and V8 Falcons, you went back to Commodores again, and in that time frame you ran two cars, again with GIO as a sponsorship, just slightly different colour scheme, right? But that was the period where you plucked Neil Crompton out of Formula Holden into touring cars. So you effectively gave him his start in the main game, as they call it today.
Yes, but Neil was driving from memory, he was driving with Steve Fraser with the mobile.
The Holden Racing
BMWs.
Oh.
And I'd been watching him. Simple as that. And he was as quick as Brock a lot of the time. So when the opportunity came and he sponsored that owned the Formula Holden, he wanted to pull out because I think that was the year, if I'm correct, that Just let me think. In the Formula Holdens, the championship that year was run by Rowan Onslow, I believe.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I think it's right. And so we had Rowan in the background as well. And so I grabbed Neil because he was they were both basically the two cars that fought out the Formula Holden series that year. Rowan came out on top, and we were sponsoring Rowan, or the GIO were also sponsoring Rowan. So, yeah, we used the opportunity. But as I said, I've been keeping an eye on Neil, and he's a great guy to have because he understands the cars, and he's good all round.
Yeah. I had a conversation with him at one point in his career. I can't even remember which year it was now, but his problem was, he said to me, I am working on television as a commentator and I'm driving racing cars. I can't do both. And I can't figure out which one to do full-time, right? So he ended up deciding to be a full-time racing driver until he became a full-time television commentator.
Yes. Yeah.
So he got the best of both worlds.
Yes, he did. Yeah.
So that year, in the context of the changeover to 5-litre cars, that first year in Commodores, I think Freddie Gibson's cars were not as quick in that first year because they didn't have sponsorship to a great degree. There was quite a mixture of results, weren't there? Because there were a whole lot of new teams trying to get to grips with a new set of rules on those Fords and Holdens.
Yes.
Did you have a lot of difficulty with it, technically?
I don't think so. If you're getting me here, it's a long while ago, really. Maybe that's when Wally Story joined us, and he helped us build the cars. So he was a friend of Neil's, and he came and worked for us, and he was a good guy to have.
Oh, yeah.
He understood the basics of the whole thing from his open wheeler days and his clubman days.
Yeah. Well, because Wally had been a driver himself.
Yes,
quite
exactly.
a successful driver.
Yeah.
Okay, switch back again we'll just do the backwards and forwards like playing tennis. We'll come back to you again, Graham. We're going to get into that sort of mid-90s period. There was something that took place which I think is probably, it'll never happen again in the context of the deal that you pulled off in the mid to late 1990s, in and around the time when 5-litre racing and 2-litre racing were sort of starting to pull apart. And that, I suppose, the only way you can put it down to is your determination to do something that you were told couldn't be done because of a comment that was made by one of the motor racing journalists who shall remain nameless, because he'd heard that you were sniffing around wanting to bring out the Works Renault team from England run by Williams Engineering, and you decided that you were just going to do it anyway. Now, that's a story. Let's start from the beginning in your words.
Righto. There's not too much of a story. It was just all about hard work. I actually knew the guy that ran, Williams Touring Car Engineering, and Didier Dubé was an ex-Bugatti team leader and manager, and I thought it'd be good to bring those cars out because I hadn't driven since 95, and this was 97, I think we bought them out, and it's a bit of a mad idea, but I thought I'd ring Didier and just say, hey, mate, what about bringing the cars out for Bathurst? And he goes, yeah, that'd be great. Anyway, we talked and talked on the phone. No emails those days. It was all faxes. And anyway, I said, what about you just go and see Frank and just see what the story is. If we put some sort of deal to them, would they be interested, even a little bit interested, and we'll go from there. So Didier went to see Frank Williams and he said, look, there's a 1,000-kilometre race, in Australia. If we put a deal together and the guys will present it to you and see what goes. He said, yeah, it's fine. yeah, put it together, and he said, we'll look at it. So that's when all the hard work started, of course. You know, it was just amazing, the work that went into it. I was up faxing all night, most nights, for months, you know. And anyway, so we put a deal or a package together that what they had to supply and manage, and what we had to supply and manage. And so Frank looked at it and he goes, yeah, that's okay. He said, I'll get a budget done. You do that part of the budget and I'll do our part of the budget, and see if the guys can come up with the money and support. So Terry Bull, my race car engineer guy, we sat down and we put our end of the deal together, which was minute to what they had to do. We had to supply a lot of the pit area stuff, transport, accommodation, and then we get their side, the deal from England. They gave us what they were going to do. So it meant bringing 27 people, flying 27 people from the UK, 2 cars, spare engines, spare corners for both cars, spare differentials, 80 wheels and tyres, all their computer work, 2 engineers that from Sedemo who built the engines. They were coming from France, and it all had to be flown out and flown back in again, you know, to the UK. So Terry and I absolutely gave, I was going to say fuck, but I won't say that. You know, we had a bit of a shake up there, and can this be real? You know, 27 people and all this accommodation. Now, we just thought we were going to do it on a slim budget and not bring, but they bought everything as a team, as the team worked in the British Touring Car Championships, which we understood after we talked about it. So I go, okay, well, let's cost it all out. I think we can do it. And our end wasn't a lot of money and not a lot of organisation. You know, we could do that easily. So they came up with a budget, and we nearly died when it all came out. So I was out sponsor hunting and friends with money and talking to everybody very secretly about it. And anyway, we ended up saying, yeah, we'll go ahead for sure. And so they said, we'll prepare a contract. So they prepared a contract, and in the process of the contract being prepared, Frank got cold feet. And this is like 5 or 6 weeks before the race, and might have been, 2 months before the race. And so I ring Frank Williams, and after Didier had been in there to see him, because when Didier said, yeah, we'll have our 2 drivers, and then Graham Moore will drive the second car, and Frank goes, who's Graham Moore? Which is fair enough. And anyway, so that was a bit of a shock to him also. And the fourth driver was, I knew who the fourth driver was, but it was my choice for the fourth driver. So we put the whole thing together, got the contract. The contract was like an inch thick of paperwork. It took me a day to go through it, and I had a lawyer look at it, and Terry and I looked at it right through and marked everything out, and they had it all organised. They'd done this.
They'd covered all the bases.
They'd done it all before, yeah. And but it was really well done and fair. The biggest problem I had with it is that before we could approach any sponsor, they had to give us written authority, so in case it was clashing with something that they've got, in the bigger picture for Formula One. So, yep, Frank said, okay, we'll go ahead, and I think he was still a little bit worried about me driving the second car and whatever, which I understood. And so he put it all together, and I flew to London and had a look at round and understood the whole thing a lot more. Went to see Frank Williams in his office, which was pretty cool. Yeah, and came home quite excited and ready to go. So we had a lot of work to do at our end, and so they booked everything. Everything was right. Everything was on time, and we were ready to go to Bathurst. So it was pretty terrifying for me, like running the whole show, not the cars, but the whole show with, just the pit area. We had cooks and all set up there and motorhomes and just for the drivers and stuff. We'd never had that before, anyway, we were pretty confident everything was going to go okay. So they get there, and I on the Wednesday I drove Helene Menu up to Bathurst, and we did about 8 laps around, showing him where the bump strips were and what to keep off and what not to do, and take it or leave it as far as my advice, and he really enjoyed it. He really impressed with the racetrack, and we had
Jason Plato.
Jason was driven up to Bathurst by my daughter Dallas, and on the Wednesday afternoon. So we do the same thing with Jason on the Wednesday afternoon. Jason sits in the back of the car, and he's got a really nice movie camera, and he did the whole 5 or 6 laps, and Jason goes, "Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, everything's good." Like, they're really professional guys, both of them. Fantastic, real good thinkers. Knew what they were about, and just shortcutting it a little bit. The next practice, or the first practice session on the Thursday, Menu was fastest in the session. He'd never been there, never seen the racetrack, never driven the cars around there, and he's the quickest car. And there were the BMWs and Audis there. I mean, a lot of good cars there. So we were quite happy about how quick he was, and so and then we get to us, Alan Jones. Alan's good. I can understand what he was doing. He was ringing up Frank Williams. "Hey, mate, who's driving that second car with Maury?" And Frank saying, "I don't know. It's up to him." Well, I didn't want to announce who was driving the second car until we had a deal. So I've sort of jumped the fence here a little bit. But in the end, we announced that Alan Jones was going to drive. And Jonesy put in his big fee, so we agreed to that, and he came. So, and they wanted him to actually qualify the car, and so they gave him a lot of practice. I think he did about 60 laps or more in the car, and I'm standing there all day Friday thinking, when's my turn? When am I going to sit my bum in the seat?
I'm paying for it.
So Friday is nil laps for GM, and Saturday morning they said, "Go out and we'll do 10 or 12 laps." So I get in the car, never driven the thing before, and it was the most beautiful race car that I've ever driven. Like, just did everything right, didn't do anything wrong, but I was very careful, so careful of it. You got to drive it like you hate it, but I was driving it like I just loved it, and went out and did some times, and Alan goes into qualifying and runs off at the end of the straight. So we start 10th in the race on Sunday, and which was all right. It's a long day. That's no drama. Saturday afternoon, Didier goes, "Graham, you are starting the race tomorrow." I go, "What?" I go, "Mate, I've done 12 laps in the car." He goes, "Doesn't matter. You're driving first." So I did my 34 laps in the car. It was all good. We were running 4th or something when I came in for the first stop, and Alan jumped in the car. Off he went, And I'm in there having a bit of a download, and they're telling me that you're losing about 3 seconds on under brakes. I was really gentle on the car, and I was pushing 450 kWs or whatever it is they were measuring it in, and Elaine was pushing 965 on the initial brake, jumping on the brakes, and they go, "What are you doing?" I go, "Well, mate, I haven't done too many laps, so I'm just loving the car and just being careful." And we're in the debrief, and on the 9th lap of Alan's drive, he sticks it into the fence, and we're still debriefing my drive, so.
And the car's coming back on a hook.
Yeah, so that was a bit of a shock. That was a bit of a shock to me. And look, he said he hit oil. I believe him. Other people didn't. But it was a bit of an experience. At least I can say I've driven with 2 world champions
yeah.
up there now, with Wayne Gardner and Alan Jones, yeah. So the other car, British drivers, they were going well. They were leading the race, 117 laps. And I told them in the laps that we went round, keep off the bump strips, because I was told from the factory that the only weak part of those cars was the diff, and they didn't make this differential, and that they didn't keep off the bump strips. They were flying high.
They crashed over them, didn't they?
Yeah, they just hit them hard, and that's how they drove them. But they'd never driven the cars over 1,000 kilometres. 117. The diff broke in Elaine's car. It was all over. Yeah. So we packed it up and all went home, all happy. I've got lovely letters from Williams saying, everything you did, you honoured. The pit facility was fantastic. The people that we had to supply some pit people, and whatever. The accommodation was all right. Because
not quite the 5-star they're used to.
No. These guys they looked after pretty well, and that's a bit of a story. But I put them into this massive, big bloody. It's an old sort of monastery or something at Bathurst, and they didn't have a private bathroom each,
Oh, gosh.
And they whinged and complained. They had a bit of a whinge, the pommies. I didn't think they even, cared about washing themselves every day, But in the end, we fixed all that. We moved some of them, and it all ended up just rosy. As I say, I've got a couple of letters from them, and very happy. Sorry that the cars didn't do justice, and that was good. So massive experience for me,
Oh, yeah.
but I hope it brought a lot of fun and interesting stuff for the public and whatever else. Yeah.
Graham, it's interesting going back to the start of that story, well, midway through the story, when you talk about arriving at Bathurst and so on. I think from memory, that weekend, of course, that was one of the 2 weekends that we had 2 races on consecutive weekends. We had the V8 race, or the Supercars race, and we had the 2-litre race on consecutive weekends because of the, let's call it the battle between the 2 groups. And we had the Supercars with Channel 10 and the 2-litre cars with Channel 7. But it's one of those things where you're talking about very, very different motor cars, and that was a time of a great deal of political upheaval within motor racing in Australia. And I'll come back to Bob in a minute, but we're talking really about the time when there was a seismic shift in who controlled motor racing. But the next question I want to ask Bob, actually, we should have asked last time round, because last time we were talking about an earlier period in Bob's career. We go back to 1975, and we're talking about the decision you made to run in the under 3-litre classification at Amaroo Park with the ARDC, and you decided instead of running a Tirana GT-R, you would buy a Holden HD X2 kitted up with equipment from the GT-R XU1s. Now, this is just a very sidebar story. That's one of the more unusual decisions to take. I believe the car only cost you $200. Is that right?
Yes, that'd be right. Yep.
And what was the decision? What was it all about?
Well, the Amscar series at Amaroo Park, they restricted it to 3-litre capacity cars. So the XU1s at the time didn't comply. But if you've got a Holden X2, it was just under 3 litres. It came with twin carburetors and manifold, and so we just decided to run it. We knew we were never going to beat the Capris. The Capri of Bo Seaton's was a fantastic little V6 and lighter, more nimble. So we just decided for a bit of fun we'd run a Holden HD. Now, I didn't really drive it. Wayne Negus, who was driving with me at the time from Western Australia, he was ex-Holden dealer team. He ran the car, and then I also, Dennis Gillespie, who was the dealer principal at one of the Suttons dealerships, he drove the car as well. So they had a lot of fun in that series. But, yeah, I remember the headline at the time saying, "What are you, Forbes?" With this with this car. But no, we had a lot of fun with that car.
Oh, well, if you're not going to win the race, you might as well have fun doing it.
Yeah, no, it was fantastic. Yeah,
I'm sure that the photographs of the day will show that the car looked. It stood out because it was the one. I mean, there were lots of Capris, lots of Mazda RX-3s, other things. And there was this one Holden, which was by that stage of the game already about 20 years old.
Yes, and blowing and not blowing smoke coming off the tyres everywhere, rubbing on the bodywork. So it got a lot of publicity, that car, for what it did. Yeah.
Well, the other question I had to ask you, which I again forgot to ask you last time round, late 1970s, you had. As Graham was talking earlier about his very ambitious idea of bringing a works team from England out to run at Bathurst, you were thinking about taking a team of Tirana A9Xs to the Le Mans 24-hour race. Now, yes. That's like sort of carting coals to Newcastle.
Exactly. I think it's one of the better ideas I had that I didn't fulfil. We got a lot of support. General Motors design department, with a guy called Leo Pruno was the chief there, and he came up with the body kit. He understood aerodynamics very, very well, and so we had a beautiful design for the aero. We had 2 shells built with a specific purpose of being a Le Mans, a practice car and the race car. But I went over there with one of our sponsors from the time was Gary and Warren Smith Holden in Melbourne, and we went across to Le Mans with him to have a look at what we were up against. And I think the thing that really tipped us from not going and deciding not to chase the money that we needed was that the engine was going to be twin turbocharged with Garrett. Garrett was sponsoring, with money to come up with the deal. It was a twin turbo V8, and the Mulsanne Straight. After you experience that, I don't reckon at that stage we could afford to develop the engine that was going to be able to go down there flat out.
Because in those days, of course, the Mulsanne Straight was the straight. It didn't have the chicane in the middle of it.
That's correct.
Which meant that it was a very, very long straight.
Yes.
And so you would have been sitting at peak revs for a long time.
Yes,
every lap.
Yeah. And that was the thing that killed it. I think everything else could have happened, but I don't think we would have had the budget, even though Garrett were helping us. I don't think we would have done it justice. So we decided not to do it.
But it's a good story. It's a great story. I mean, that's one of those things. That's one whole half a page in your CV of the things that you should have but didn't quite do.
Yeah. No, it was good. And the shells got built up into race cars. Larry Perkins and Peter Jansen
Ended up with one of those shells.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they built it into a car. We had John Brookfield. He was doing the roll cages for them. He did all the Melbourne guys' roll cages back in that era. And we sent a car to him, and he put the cage in it. But then we pulled the pin on the deal and decided not to go ahead. And Peter and Larry got that shell and built into a car. I think it came second at Bathurst. It was a Schweppes.
Yes, one of the yellow car.
Yellow car.
Yeah.
It sold just recently.
Okay.
For $1 million.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yep.
Well, I want to know how Forbesy got the key to get into General Motors, because he used to go to Melbourne. They'd put the red carpet out for him, a car from the airport, straight to General Motors, and Forbesy had the key to the door to go in. It's unbelievable. Huh?
I wish. It must have seemed that way. But, I spent a lot of time on the production line there, building body shells and
tell us about that, Forbesy, because I know nothing about that.
Well, there's nothing much to it, Graham.
They're all double seam welded and all, very strong and whatever. And
they were stiff solid.
Us poor privateers, we used to pull them off the showroom
you
floor.
You could have gone there too, though.
And paint them. I'd never been there.
You were too busy making money at your panel shop.
I better interrupt this, otherwise we're going to go down an entirely different course. I'll stay with you for a minute, Bob. We talked about the Commodore era after the changeover in the early 1990s, after the Nissans were effectively thrown out of the door. 1993, towards the end of 93, you sold everything. Now, that was when Wayne Gardner came and tapped you on the shoulder and said, I'm going to run a race team. And I believe that not only did you sell all the cars, all the equipment, Neil Crompton went with the team, and the yarn goes that they even took the phone off the wall in the workshop.
Yeah, that's right. They took it literally. So they had it right. Alan Heafy was the team manager. He came up from Melbourne. Yeah, so they took everything.
So basically you walked back into an empty room.
We had 2 factory units, and when I got there after the deal was finished, there was absolutely nothing. No toilet paper, no telephone, but and good on them.
Well,
but it was a simple deal.
And Forbesy had a pocket full of money. That was important, mate.
I was under the impression that Bob always had a pocket full of money.
Give me a break.
Okay. Now it becomes, let's call it a little bit, I wouldn't say political, but the next stage in your career, Bob, was the time in which you decided to become involved with TIGA, with the Touring Car Interest Group, and you took over what can only be referred to as a managemental role in negotiations between the Touring Car Interest Group and the circuits. And there was a period during which you set up what then, over a period of time and with people like Tony Cochrane, became V8 Supercars, which simply then became Supercars Australia. So you were at the coalface of that seismic change in how motor racing in this country ran and who paid for what. So can you just give us a cut-down version of that time frame?
Well, it all coincided with me selling the team to Coca-Cola, to Wayne Gardner. So I no longer had any barrow to push as far as the team was concerned, so I took on the role of trying to make work what had been the entrants had been trying to have a group for quite a few years, but vested interests with the competitors always scurried the deal because they were pushing their sponsors,
their own particular needs.
Barrow, yeah. So the thing kept on falling over. The concept was fine, and a lot of the team owners understood the whole idea of what we were trying to do. So I took that role on, and it all worked because we were.
Well, that's a simplification, Bob.
Yeah, well, it did though, because we needed to get everybody on side firstly to stop the white anting of what was going on, and we were able to do that. We got the major team players, Dick Johnson, Larry Perkins, Bo Seaton,
Holden Dealer team,
Holden Racing Team, with John Quentin and the guys. So they all saw what the benefits were, because people wouldn't know, but we go to a race meeting, we have to put on the show, so to speak, and I think, I can't remember precisely in our records, but how many pit passes you got. So it might take a team of 16 people to run 2 cars to a racetrack, and you get 5 or 10 pit passes. So you had to buy the balance of the pit passes. And we would, often, if there was another event on, like say a Formula One event on, we'd be in a paddock somewhere where no one had taken any notice of us. Anyhow, it all worked. Got everybody to join up, and then we're able to start asking for appearance money, because the circuit owners and operators, they tried to format a group, or to form a group, and that was unsuccessful. So I end up being the negotiator with the circuit owners and operators to put on the events and what we would charge to go there. So the idea was to keep the teams viable. That's what it was all about.
Because that's really, up until that point, motor racing had always worked on the basis that the competitors paid the organisers to actually attend the event and compete. And there was prize money from the organisers. And when sponsorship had come along in the late 60s, 68, early 69, when I say sponsorship, I'm talking about advertising on cars.
Yes.
That opened doors that had previously been firmly shut. So the organisers of the events basically said that you as competitors had to provide your own sponsorship and bring that along to the benefit of the organisers of the events. So yes, there were effectively 2 different groups that were holding hands but were facing in different directions.
Yes, that's true.
And you had the situation, as you said a moment ago, with the teams. It was like herding cats, wasn't it? Because they were all facing not necessarily in the same direction in terms of what they wanted out of the new deal.
But I must say the smarter ones, the smarter people, they understood where it was all, what the idea was, and it was a fair idea. The circuit owners and operators would get the attendance fee or the television money at the time, but it was mainly the attendance fee. That's how they were funding the events.
So that basically there was a gap in your career of approximately 5 years when you sold everything to Wayne Gardner. You went through this, let's call it your political career, in terms of organising and the early days of Avesco, the V8 touring car organisation. And then 5 years later you decided to come back again. So you did a deal with Ford, which I think was your first Ford deal as far as major deals are concerned, and you were able to bring a young, very, very popular man by the name of Craig Lowndes across, and I refer to that era, that relatively short era, as the era of the green-eyed monster.
Yes, that's right, but I wasn't the one that brought the Ford deal along. That was a gentleman called Noel Watson and Fred Gibson, that they'd been trying to get a deal with Ford to have Lowndes drive their car, because Ford wanted a presence. They didn't have an Alan Moffat any longer, or even a Glenn Seaton, I guess, and they thought Lowndes was the person to have, and I think they were correct.
So they were looking for a second team, like parallel to the Dick Johnson team.
but they didn't have the funding that they needed to set up a team. So they got me involved, and I bought what was known as Gibson Motorsport, but it wasn't owned by the Gibson people, Fred Gibson and the family. It was actually owned by a gentleman called Gary Dumbrell, who was the Wins agent in Australia. So Gary was the one that I bought the team from to be able to swap immediately from Holdens to Fords.
So that was in what, roughly what year?
2001.
Okay. But you only ran one car, didn't you?
No, we ran two. We ran Neil Crompton.
That's of course right, yes.
That's the second car. I think it was 2001 and 2002 is what it was.
So in effect, you came along as the what's the right way of phrasing it? The coordinator of that, because you had the other two gentlemen, you had Freddie Gibson running the team as in terms of the day-to-day operation.
Fred was the manager, and he'd been managing the team that carried his name for Mr. Dumbrell. And so when we bought Mr. Dumbrell, we left Fred on as the
it was the team manager.
The team manager.
Gotcha. Yeah, and that was probably one of the more exciting eras because for a start, your car, the Lowndes car ran with 00 as the number.
Yes,
and nobody had ever thought of doing that before.
No.
Whose idea was that?
I think that would have been. I don't know. I think it was Noel Watson's.
Okay, right. Because when that was announced, it was like, whoa, there's an idea. It really did open a lot of eyes. And then, of course, you rolled out that silver and grey car with the bright lime green headlights, and that just took everybody's breath away.
Yeah, well, that was later in the year. In the beginning of the year, they were silver and black cars with just Ford
logo,
Mobil and Dunlop sponsorship on them.
Mm-hmm.
And then because that car was a Stone Brothers car, Mr. Polides from Ford had arranged for Stone Brothers to sell us one of their current cars that had been raced. So we got the car and took it to our workshop in Melbourne and Gibsonised it, let's say.
Yeah.
And then we had a second car for Neil, which wasn't a particularly good car. It was just a car that had been running around, an AU Falcon, Group A car. But then we spent that up until Bathurst building the Green-Eyed Monster. So the Green-Eyed Monster's first race was Bathurst 2001.
Right.
And by that stage we had Falcon budgeted, tipped more money in. So it was a Ford Falcon car.
That was, certainly that was one of the more memorable entries into the category, and I think really that was also one of those exercises where public relations played a lot to do with its popularity. I mean, you had two really well-known, very, very high-profile, very, very competent drivers with obviously a very well put-together team. It must have been very enjoyable to come back and do that, even for only a couple of years. And then you decided that was enough and you just sort of packed your bags and quietly exited stage left.
There's a bit more to all of that, but yes, let's just sum it up like that.
Exactly. Okay. Yeah, we won't go down that path today. Graham, I'll come back to you for sort of getting towards the sign-off of today. You both had really extensive careers. Possibly, Graham, you drove more cars, you drove in more races, I think possibly overall, than Bob. How do you rate yourself as, well, basically I'll ask you both the same question. How do you rate yourself as racing drivers now looking back on your career? Because you drove so many different cars over, a 30-year period, roughly?
Mm-hmm.
Do you put yourself up there as the? Because as I said at the very beginning of this exercise last time round, you two are the best of the rest, as it were. You guys are the best of the guys who weren't in a works team all the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a bit tough asking you that question. But all I can say, everyone I've driven with, and I've driven with a lot of guys, I've been as fast as everyone except one guy, and that's Michel Delcourt. I've driven with Dick, I've driven with Gricey, I've driven with lots of other people. Somewhere along the way I was very close to them, or maybe a little better. And mainly because I just love the sport. I'm still passionate about the sport today. I watch every race, what's going on, and try and keep up a little bit. But as privateers, you could only do the best with what you had. And the privateer thing annoys me also, that most of the press of the day and the press of today, in past times we used to get quite a bit of press, but not enough to sort of to promote what we were trying to do. In the old days, we had my daughter used to do most of the PR stuff when we did Wayne Gardner and all that stuff, and we did well. But I don't think that the privateers got enough credit for what they put together in races at Bathurst, where there's 62 starters, and nowadays there's 20 starters, and without those 62 guys, and all but about 2 guys were all privateers, and you never see a photograph of another Commodore driver, Terry Finnegan. How long is it since you've seen a photograph of Terry Finnegan or guys like him that battle through? I just think that it's a bit of a shame what you guys do at Muscle Car Masters. Every now and then you go back a little bit and come up with stuff. But, I think there was a lot of bloody good drivers in the era that we drove. And there's probably only one guy that stood out. It was Brock, in my view. As I said, I've driven with quite a few drivers, and in '72 I sort of put up a good show in the rain, and soon as the rain stopped, they just drove away from me. So that gives you a good bit of heart and a bit of confidence. But generally I think the privateers, good privateers, never got enough credit.
Well, frankly, the good privateers occupied 60% of the grid, effectively, in those races. The so-called works teams, when there were multiple works teams, multiple different manufacturers, occupied about a third of the grid at the most. I think you're quite right. I think that the people who filled the field quite often, and I mean, you finished in the top 10 at Bathurst more than once.
Oh, yeah.
And that is great credit to you. And Bob, you're the same. I mean, the two of you, as I said at the very beginning, the best of the rest, because you are up there with, like, please forgive me when I say this, but you're up there with people like Peter Jansen. Peter always came with more money because he had more sponsorship. But, you finished in that same group of very, very professional, I don't say professional amateurs, but professional privateers. And Bob, yourself, I mean, you were a very competent racing car driver in your era. You must have enjoyed it.
I did enjoy it very much, but I was the conservative one. Graham was always quicker than me, but I had a lot more top 10 finishes than he did.
You've been looking up Google, have you?
Well, that's but what is the expression? Racing drivers are not really competitive until the day they die.
That's good. I like that one, Forbesy. That's a good one.
Look, gentlemen, I think today's been terrific, and I'm so glad that you agreed to come back and do a second round with this thing, because we've covered a lot more ground this afternoon than we had previously. Your careers, I think, are amongst the most talented and the most experienced, and you've achieved the best results of the great majority of people in your group, in your time frame. And you've both done things that other people probably thought would never be done. And I congratulate you both on having such great careers. And thank you very much for attending today. This is Ray Berghouse signing off again. Well, friends, that's the conclusion of another episode of the Australian Muscle Car Magazine podcast series. We hope you enjoyed the tales contained herein and look forward to seeing you again soon. In the meantime, be sure to check out musclecarmag.com.au for news stories, news and galleries from the Muscle Car Vault. We add them weekly, as well as brand new digital issues as soon as they become available on the newsstand. Thanks for listening, and as always, safe driving and happy reading from the team at Australian Muscle Car Magazine.